we're going to spend a few minutes laying out a framework for the way that we're going to consider U.S. history from the time of the Civil War so on. And we're going to do that in terms of three, or actually four, different themes that will accompany us through the entire study. So the four different themes are going to be mission and manifest destiny, industrialization, imperialism, and race. Okay, and I'm going to start off by talking a little bit about mission and manifest destiny, and the we inherit really our idea of mission going really all the way back to the classical era, the Christian church when it was founded with the idea that it had a mission to spread the gospel, and that becomes a defining characteristic of Europeans during the Middle Ages. What's interesting about that is that at the time of the Middle Ages, Europe was kind of a backwater. It was probably not as developed and prosperous as places like, for example, China or India or even West Africa. Um, and so, if you were like, I think if you were going to look at all the different civilizations in the world in, say, 1500 as baseball teams, Europe would have been the Padres. I mean, it's like we like the Padres, but they're not going to the World Series, or that's the way it seems, generally speaking. And what one of the kind of very interesting things about Western history, starting in around 1500 and really accompanying the United States through its history, is that by the time we get to 1900, this, you know, backwards baseball team, the Padres, actually won the World Series. And that's the surprising thing. And that's one of the things that we'll trace as we go through this course. Okay. Anyway, so mission then is this idea that we have a mission to spread our ideology. And that ideology in medieval Europe was Christianity. And when the Spanish came to America, they carried that ideology with them. So they came, actually, interestingly, the Spanish didn't expect to find America. And when they did find America, um, that wasn't what they had in mind in terms of their goal. Their goal was basically to be able to trade with China and make lots of money. But instead, what they found was America, and they were able to extract a lot of resources from that. But at the same time, they saw it as their duty actually to evangelize. So it's interesting that the Spanish sent conquistadores, but they also sent missionaries, and so we see then this idea of mission coming to America again as a mission to spread the Christian gospel, and then moving into North America, the British North America, when the so-called pilgrims came to New England, they came with a mission, and again, it was a religious mission. Their idea was that the Christian church had failed. It had failed in its covenant with God, and that their duty, their mission, essentially, was to create a God-fearing society that would be a model of the way God wants people to live. So they call themselves a city upon a hill. The idea being that they would create this model Christian society, and that model Christian society would be uh, attractive to everyone else in the world. So all of the world would be drawn to the Christian lifestyle, essentially, right? Then from the time of the settlement of New England in the early 17th century and the American Revolution in the latter part of the 18th century, we see a shift in European culture away from identifying with religion. The Enlightenment actually was a rejection of Christianity it wasn't a rejection of God necessarily, but it was a rejection of Christianity. And their idea was that rather than God revealing himself to men in the church and in scripture, God revealed himself to man through nature. And the way to understand uh, God was to understand nature, to study nature, which turns out to be then science, or as an extension of that, reason. So that's one of the reasons why they call it the Age of Reason. And the American Revolution basically, I mean, it was part of that intellectual shift in Europe. The United States really was the first um, political state built on the ideas of the Enlightenment. Um, and so, what we see happening by the time we get to the American Revolution is that the American society still has this sense of mission, but now the sense of mission is to spread this new Enlightenment philosophy, liberalism. Now, when we say liberalism, you might think, Bernie Sanders and the Democrats, but actually, liberalism in our context is a political state that's built on three different um, principles: democracy or secular democracy or popular sovereignty, and secularism, which is separation of church and state. In the United States, we have um, no official state religion, and there's theoretically no restriction on how people practice their religion. That's secularism. And then capitalism, which is basically that the government keeps its hands off of the economy and the economy runs itself. That's not the way it really works, but that's the idea behind what they call laissez-faire capitalism, right? So these three elements, democracy, secularism, and capitalism, all add up to liberalism, classical liberalism, or in my classes, I use a code word, liberty, with the exclamation point. Liberty with the exclamation point means democracy, secularism, and capitalism. Okay, and the American ethos, I guess you could say, the American sense of mission, going all the way back to the very beginning of the country, is that its mission was to spread this this idea, this liberalism, this idea of liberty. Okay, and mostly that's going to be confined to the North American continent, but nevertheless, it is this idea of spreading America's way of life. Okay, and even though the United States actually was able to control all of the North American continent by the time we get to the end of the 19th century, um, at the same time, there was this idea that the United States needs to be able to spread its liberalism even up to this day. So if we look, for example, World War I was about American mission to spread democracy. World War II, the same thing, save the world from totalitarianism. And even today, if we look at, for example, the invasion of Iraq or Afghanistan, well, especially Iraq, if we look at the invasion of Iraq and we realize that Iraq is a source of oil, so many people would say, okay, well, the United States says it stands for democracy, but it really wants the oil, and that may be true. But at the same time, when President Bush was trying to sell the invasion of Iraq to the American people, he didn't say we need to go in there and get the oil. He said we need to go in and establish democracy. And Americans bought that. Okay, so that shows us that even though Americans are quite cynical now about American foreign policy, and as is pretty much the rest of the world, nevertheless, Americans still believe that they have a mission to spread democracy or liberalism, liberty. Okay, and then I want to actually just spend a couple minutes talking about Manifest Destiny. Manifest Destiny, probably you guys, if you know about Manifest Destiny, you think it's the God-given right of Americans to overspread the continent from the Atlantic to the Pacific. And that's one way of looking at it, but it's not the original way of looking at it. The original way of looking at it was that um, manifest destiny means that it's the obvious destiny, and the idea was that it would be the obvious destiny of all places in the world to eventually be ruled in like manner to the United States, right? So the idea then behind Manifest Destiny was that the United States was a temple of liberty, and that the states were kind of members of the Temple of Liberty, and that the only way to become a member of the Temple of Liberty was to be ready by implementing a liberal government. And so the idea then was that eventually everybody would be able to do that, and so everybody would be able to enjoy liberalism. During and after the Mexican American War is when we see Manifest Destiny take on a more aggressive tone, where people will say, okay, well, Manifest Destiny really is this ideology that it's our destiny to control the continent, and that anybody that stands in our way is standing against God. So basically, then we can look at Manifest Destiny as two different things, really. And interestingly, that's one of the things that we'll see as we go through this course, is that the United States is always at least two different things. Okay, the first one in this case is going to be mission, the mission of Manifest Destiny. You can read this. I'm going to leave it up, and you can go back and look at it again later. But the main thing here is to say that boundless future will be the era of American greatness in its magnificent domain of space and time. The nation of many nations is destined to manifest to mankind the excellence of divine principles. Okay, and basically, it becomes kind of an idealistic concept, and this was kind of the original idea of the concept. Here's a good picture of what we think of as the Temple of Liberty. In this case, the Temple of Liberty is the federal system, and that the members of the temple are the various states. And the only way that you can enter the temple and be part of the temple is to be ready. And the only way to be ready is to have a liberal government. So when the United States conquered, essentially, Mexico, many people believed that Mexicans could not be part of the United States because essentially, as John Calhoun said, non-white people were not able to rule themselves, not able to experience democracy. Okay, so so many people then at the end of the Mexican-American War said, well, we don't want Mexico because Mexico can't be part of our ideal. Okay, but the other kind of catalyst for American acquisition of territory was economics. That the United States, first of all, wanted to be able to control the West Coast and the access to the West Coast so that the United States could trade with China. And so Manifest Destiny becomes a kind of a justification for that aggressive behavior. One of the things that the United States actually acquired California as part of the Mexican-American War. And right after California became part of the United States, that's when they found gold in California. So President Polk went before Congress and said, it's obvious that it was our manifest destiny to control California because that gold was there, but nobody found it until we owned it. So that's his idea of manifest destiny. And so I'm just going to leave it. This is an interesting picture, but we'll look at it in a different lecture later on. Okay, so that's going to be a kind of a summary of mission mission is going to accompany the American experience from really from the very beginning until today. We talked in the last segment about how backwards Europe, the Padres baseball team, which nobody expected to win the World Series, actually did win the World Series by becoming at the beginning of the 20th century, basically controlling all parts of the world that were worth controlling. And the reason for that was because of industrialization. And so the very first thing that we're going to look at after this introductory session is going to be industrialization, because it will have a significant effect on not only U.S. history but world history and every aspect of it. Okay, so starting with what is industrialization is the transformation of an agrarian economy to a manufacturing economy. That transformation started in England in the late 18th century, and in the United States in the beginning of the 19th century. Before the Civil War, we saw that the United States was the northern part of the United States was industrializing rapidly, but the southern part of the United States continued to be more or less an agrarian stronghold. And the result of that was that the national government couldn't actually enact policies that were good for both areas of the country. And since the population of the North continued to grow and the population of the South stagnated, the South continuously lost influence in the federal government. And the result of that was the Civil War. Okay. After the Civil War, again, the United States is able to continue to industrialize, and the South becomes an internal colony, which I'm pretty sure I explained that in the last lecture, so I don't really want to go into it right now. The main thing is that the South became a provider of resources and markets for the North, and the North actually then became the manufacturing center. Okay. By the time we get to the turn of the 20th century, the United States is the world's leading industrial power, although most of the world doesn't recognize that until well after World War One. And again, as I mentioned, we're going to be talking about industrialization starting right after this introductory lecture, and we will be industrialization will affect every aspect of American life and American history for the rest of this course. Industrialization and imperialism go hand in hand. Imperialism essentially is when one country is able to control the resources of another country. There's a few different ways that could be done. The kind of classical way, the way that the European powers did it, was by actually ending up ruling the colonies. And the United States is going to be a little bit different. It will implement what's known as economic imperialism, where the United States doesn't actually control the country, but does control doesn't control the government of the country, but does control its economy. All right. The United States is an imperialist power. The United States began imperial expansion immediately after the Revolutionary War, but most of the American imperial expansion happened on the North American continent until the 1890s. And by that time, all of the North American continent had been essentially subdued. And so the United States began to look overseas for imperial expansion. And that expansion, again, was driven by American industry, but it was also supported by the idea of mission. So often accompanying American imperial expansion is the idea that the United States is bringing civilization and enlightenment to the uh, benighted peoples of the world, in, for example, the Philippines or in Latin America, something like that. Finally, one thing that has burdened the United States from the very beginning has been the concept of race. Race, the way that it has been traditionally experienced in the United States, is according to a formula that basically says whiteness equals privilege. Now, I know that perhaps some of you think that the idea of white privilege is ridiculous. I actually will show that it's not ridiculous. It's not something that white people need to necessarily be defensive about, but it does actually exist, and it has always existed. Where the idea was, if you were white in the United States, you had privilege. If you were not white, then you didn't have privilege, and this was not necessarily confined to skin color. So we often think of racism as having to do with ethnicity or race or skin color, blackness or Asian or Native American, something like that, Hispanic. But in reality, a number of different groups were considered to be not white, but were able to work their way into whiteness and basically assimilate into whiteness, including the Irish and Eastern Europeans, Italians, Southern Europeans. But there are some groups of people in the United States have never been able to work their way into whiteness. After the Civil Rights Movement, the definition of race or the definition of privilege actually changed, where privilege was no longer legally tied to whiteness, but was rather tied to equal opportunity. So one thing that we should note from the very beginning is slavery and race are different issues. They become associated together in the United States because of the United States essentially made it so that it was impossible in many places to be black and free, particularly in the South. So slavery becomes associated with race or blackness, but in reality, slavery and race were two different phenomena. So on the one hand, we had slavery and abolitionism, the idea of getting rid of slavery, but many people who believed that slavery was wrong at the same time were still racist. They still believed that black people were inferior to white people, and so the result was that the result was that, for example, people believed that even though the slavery itself was wrong, that black people could never actually black people could never actually exist or operate within democracy. And so many people suggested that what should happen should be that we should send all the black people back to Africa, which was problematic at that point because they weren't from Africa. They were born here, most of them, by the time emancipation happened. Okay, going all the way back to the colonial era, there was the institution of what's called the Black Codes, which is legal segregation of blacks and whites. It's really the the creation of a legally inferior separated class based on skin color. And the reason for that, actually, it was implemented in the beginning to pit basically poor whites and poor blacks against each other, because there was some threat of the poor blacks and poor whites uniting against the elites. And so basically racism was enforced as a way to protect elite privilege, and it has worked that way really all the way up until today. So basically the idea of race and racism, the purpose of race and racism is to keep blacks and whites from uniting against the elites. Okay, now I already mentioned that somebody can be anti-slavery and at the same time racist. And one thing that a couple of things about racism that we want to note is that we often consider racism to be somehow endemic in the South, which it really is, but it's not just in the South. Racism, the United States has been a thoroughly racist country all the way through. So, for example, in World War II, when black regiments were separated from white regiments, that wasn't white Southern regiments that were separated, it was American regiments. And when American baseball was divided between black baseball and white baseball, it wasn't Southern baseball that was divided, it was American baseball. So America has had to grapple with the issue of race, and it's not just a sectional or local issue in the South, okay? And even though we have made great strides in racial equality, we still have to admit that race continues to haunt American national life. And again, I think that one of the ways that we can tell that that's true is that there are a number of people who don't want to talk about it. And if it was not a problem, we would not be worried about talking about it. So anyway, so the race again is going to be something that accompanies the American experience right from the very beginning, and it's something that we'll have to look at as we go through the rest of this course. So that's pretty much the end of my discussion of the themes and definitions of our course. Next, we'll be moving on and looking at industrialization as kind of an as a kind of a ideology.